On January 15th, 2025, the United States Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in a case called Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton. This case will determine the fate of 19 state laws protecting children from access to online pornography through mandatory age verification requirements. Most children are first exposed to pornography when they are somewhere between 7 and 13 years old, and by the time they are 18, most of them have seen it. This case is historic, but for far more than just this reason. Pornography is the marketing arm of the sexual revolution, and it has been since that revolution got going in the 1960s. Now, the Supreme Court could rule in June that states have the right and duty to protect children from the harms of pornography. Such a ruling would unseat the ethics of the sexual revolution from its place in the minds of most people as the primary lens through which they think about and engage in physical intimacy. In this series, we will explore the broken promises and heartbreaking results of the sexual revolution, primarily through the internet, and thereby gain a better understanding of just how much is at stake in this historic case. My name is Joseph Kohm. I'm the Policy Director of Family Policy Alliance, and you're listening to a podcast series called Truth Exposed. So with me on this episode, we're going to talk about the angle of the research that goes into all of this negative impacts and harm of the internet to children and families. And we are so blessed to have a really great guest from a great organizational ally, and that is Jason Carroll, who's a senior fellow from the Institute for Family Studies. Jason is a senior fellow, as I said, with IFS. And we're so fortunate to have him join us. I don't want to spend too much time on his background. I'd rather have him tell you about it. So, Jason, thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Joseph, you bet. Thanks for having me. It's great to have a chance to get the word out on some of this information.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you on and your expertise and all you're going to share with us. So before we really dive into that, I'd love for you to briefly just tell the audience a little about your professional background, and then maybe tell them what drove you to the field of research, specifically as it regards to the subject of the internet and the potential harms it presents for families and children.
Yeah, for me, it's an interesting path and direction. My background is in marriage prediction research. I was trained in graduate school in one of the top marriage prediction labs, and my research has been looking at trajectories of healthy marriages and what helps marriages flourish and do well. But back in 2008, we did a study looking at young adults and patterns before marriage and how they'd predict later marital outcomes. We put two questions. We put two questions in that study about pornography, about use and attitudes around it. And that study still continues to be one of my most highly cited studies of my career. So I kind of stumbled into that, but we started to see the significance of the issue and started to build a more sophisticated program of study around that. And then just in time, technology issues in general. Nobody can study relationships and families and marriages today without seeing how technology issues are undermining flourishing relationships. So increasingly, it's just become an area of emphasis, and both in my work at the Institute for Family Studies as a senior fellow there, we have a technology initiative there as well. I'm also the research director at the Wheatley Institute at Brigham Young University, and we've made this another area of emphasis for us as well. So it just all kind of came along, I guess. Just the need is what pulled us into that, even though that wasn't our initial intention.
Yeah, that's great. It's a powerful emerging issue area as tech becomes more and more prevalent in families, and really there become less and less options for families to live without or with lower forms of technology. So it's an important issue area, and we're talking about it specifically in the pornography context leading up to this case next month or here in January. So let's start with the basics, because I've already alluded to the fact that children are viewing pornography at dramatic rates. So I would like you to tell our audience, Jason, exactly how prevalent is pornography exposure and consumption amongst children, and what does the social science show us about that, proving it?
Yeah, and let me say this as we get started, Joseph. Right, we submitted an amicus brief to the Supreme Court our team connected to IFS. And so that documents a lot of this research. And we're also in the process here as we get ready for oral arguments in January. We'll be releasing a public report through IFS and Wheatley. And so we'll throw out a lot of stats and things here, but I'd like people to know that there's going to be good resources for them to go to that they can track. So, the percentages vary a little bit from study to study, but the evidence is just clear. The current rising generation has more access to pornography than any generation in history. That's not an overstatement at all. And because of that access, the vast majority of teenagers, by the time we're getting into late teenage years, have been exposed to pornography. It's usually somewhere in about the 70-80% range for girls and somewhere in the 80 to 90% range for boys, depending on the study. But it's very conclusive right now that pornography is the norm of teenage development in our culture. It is not the exception, which goes completely against any idea that we're dealing with adult material or mature audience material. It is now the norm of teenage development.
Yeah, it's sad as part of the rise of technology. And maybe we'll get into later how that same rise, that same growth of technology is what's also going to help protect them through these age verification procedures. But Jason, maybe I mentioned during the introduction that the average age of first exposure to pornography is between 7 and 13. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about all that truth, the range of age where kids are getting first exposed, and maybe how they're getting first exposed to it.
Yeah, I mean, one piece I think we should throw out here, and it's going to tie into so many things we're going to talk about, right? Is there's some evidence showing that well over half, the one study found it to be 58% of all first encounters with pornography that children and teens are having are unintentional, right? The child wasn't looking for pornography. Pornography was looking for them. Right. And so we have to keep that in mind, that funnel process that is out there to try to pull in and have that process. So I think what is happening is many parents are trying to give their children what I would call level 1 or level 2 technology experiences. Oh, I wanted to give them a smartphone because I wanted them to be able to call home when they needed, or know when they needed to be picked up, or send a text to their friend in their class. And parents often are not aware that they're actually opening up to their child level 3, level 4, and level 5 technology experiences. So as we've seen technology filter younger, exposure to pornography is moving. We're well below the high school years, and we're even getting below the junior high years. This is now becoming a grade school issue for many kids, where this exposure is happening. And the important thing to recognize with that too, we talked about the prevalence of exposure. Probably the more concerning trend right now too is the documentation of habitual use, right? There's some studies showing that we're as high as 1 in 4 of teenage boys viewing pornography daily, right? And we know that habitual use often gets started with early exposure, and that habitual use is what puts them at such risk for compulsive and addictive use in later life. So there's different ways we look at it: overall exposure, habitual use, early age of exposure, and all of them point in directions of children being unprotected from porn.
Let me ask you just 2 quick follow-ups to that, Jason. First of all, many of our listeners and supporters are going to be devout people of faith from all denominations and regular churchgoers, which means they go more often than not every Sunday. And that automatically puts them in the minority of the more devout Christians in at least the United States. My first follow-up is, are those exposure and habitual use statistics, is there much variance within them for people inside and outside of the church, i.e. regular churchgoers and people who are not regular churchgoers?
Yeah, the good news is that religious involvement, and as the involvement increases, right? So if it's church attendance, but we've also found in studies, we did a series of studies at the Wheatley Institute that showed that home-based religious practice is particularly powerful. But the good news is that religious engagement does tend to be a bit of a protective factor. Highly religious young people are less likely to use pornography. They're less likely to engage in the habitual use of pornography. Much of it, I think, has to do with parents are doing the best they can to create what I'd call maybe external controls, external safeguards. But we know that in today's culture and environment, all young people are going to eventually reach a point that there's going to need to be some internal control, some internal safeguards. And so having those values, seeing the counterfeit that is offered in pornography, how it is the opposite of healthy, sustained relationships, real relationships, as parents are able to teach that. And I think the foundations of faith are often a core to that, because they will emphasize commitment and enduring love and the need to be in those sacrificial relationships that are just none of those things are found in what is presented in pornography.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you for answering that. 'Cause I think that I think that should be encouraging to our listeners who are churchgoers without being a total let off for them. I don't want them to think just because my family goes to church every Sunday that we're going to be totally immune to this. But because lots of churches do still have, when you're talking about rates of addiction or exposure that are this high, that means that even if it's substantially reduced by an offsetting factor like that, there's still going to be significant levels in your relatively protected community. So I only preface that. I only say that as a preface, just so that people know, like, if you go to church regularly, you're setting yourself and your kids up well. Doesn't mean you're totally not going to run into this, but you're in better shape than most. So
what I like what you're saying there is, this is an unsavory topic for many of us. We just would prefer not to deal with this. It's just counter to what we believe and what we value. But it's just becoming, we just have to be knowledgeable. We have to be aware. The number of parents I've worked with in counseling or other situations say, I didn't know there was pornography on the social media platforms. I thought as long as we didn't give them, an internet browser, I didn't know that could be found, type of thing. And so I think it's just one of those things we can't afford, even though it's an unpleasant topic in many ways. I just think we have to be knowledgeable. We have to be aware, and we have to be able to engage with our children in very direct ways. They want that direct conversation, and parent relationships have been found to be powerful. They're powerful factors in this issue, that kids are able to address, prevent things from happening, but also address issues as they do come up.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because you're right. None of us want to be talking about this. None of us want to engage in this. I mean, I think our organizations volunteer to engage with it and with the unsavory actors in it, so that other people don't have to the same degree. But when the threat is this grave, particularly to our kids, it's not a subject we can afford to avoid anymore. And I want to get into now how grave that threat is. So, Jason, maybe we could talk a little bit. I want you to talk about the specific negative impacts that pornography and the internet generally can have on a child's brain and their overall life and well-being. Tell us about those physiological and social impacts of this exposure.
Sure. And that's the main thing we do in our brief and the main thing in the report. And just as a little primer, I want to emphasize for everybody listening, we're not talking about just one or two studies in each of these areas, right? The research has now matured to a point that we go through in our brief, and we go to what's called meta-analyses. These are studies that study other studies, and do the large reviews. I've got a list pulled up here. I mean, we looked at, and these are studies with 43 studies, 59 studies, 61 studies, 50 studies, right? We're talking about, so, there's always a little bit of variation of the exact number or the exact, but one of the things we really pay attention to in scientific evidence is the accumulation, right? If it all starts to point in a direction, it all starts to give a common narrative, our confidence just increases of what we're finding. So the areas that we document that the research is particularly strong. It's clear that pornography is linked to unhealthy sexual practices among teens, early sexual initiation, and unhealthy sexual patterns practices. There's just a script there. There's an unhealthy script that's given to children. It's not around love and commitment and enduring relationships and monogamy, right? It's so that we just see that start to act out. Their young minds don't distinguish between reality and the distortion and the counterfeit there very well. One of the more troubling areas, there was a two meta-analyses recently done, one with 43 studies that showed pornography's strong links to sexual aggression and sexual violence, and another meta-analysis with 59 studies that show that. It's important for everybody to understand, again, we don't want to be aware of these things, but the content of pornography is changing as well. And over the last 2 decades, this is not the centerfold magazines of generation past. This isn't just the depiction of nudity. This is graphic videos with many of them having violent content and deviant behaviors and these types of things. There's almost kind of a arms race, if you will, that, no one wants to do been there, done that porn anymore. They're trying to draw attention by something that is different. And unfortunately, that has led to a lot of aggression and violence and dominance themes in this. I should emphasize here too, there's now 2 types of studies looking at this. Some are just content studies. They actually go in and content rate the videos themselves. But some of the most discouraging studies recently have done some looking at teenagers themselves reporting what they're seeing. So the content is there, and the other studies are showing they're finding it, and they're finding it regularly, and they're being impacted by it. There's a much greater likelihood to engage in sexual violence and violent behaviors if you're engaging with that pornography. We also look at mental health outcomes. There's a real connection here to mental health struggles, to body image issues. And as I mentioned earlier, that habitual use is becoming compulsive use. So there's a whole line of research on problematic pornography use, where it becomes just a compulsive, addictive pattern in someone's life. It creates all sorts of difficulties and struggles, very similar to what we see oftentimes with substance addictions and other types of patterns around that. And then there's also quite a bit of research that shows that this lingers well into family formation issues into young adulthood. So we see relationships struggling, greater likelihood of breakups, greater likelihood of divorce, greater likelihood of relationship struggles when these patterns are there. So it's just across the board, just about every element of well-being you can look at has negative directions and patterns of it. There's just nothing out there showing that this has any sense. It's not even finding it to be neutral, let alone beneficial. It all trends in the direction of negative effects.
Absolutely. That's why we've titled this series Truth Exposed, because everything you just said, Jason, the things we've talked about are things people don't find intuitive and really have no idea about. I mean, there's this incredible amount of research, and we'll talk about how big that mountain is pretty soon. But people don't realize this is how serious it is. People think of pornography as just something, oh, it's no big deal. Maybe it's even enhancing my sex life. And not only is there no research to support that, but everything you've told us shows that the research shows the opposite.
Yeah.
All these negative impacts for health and wellness and for future family formation, which will be so important to our audience. And I should mention here that in the next episode in the series, we'll have a pediatric assault nurse who will talk to us about how what young people are learning from sex in terms of the violence and aggression does play itself out in actual pediatric sex crimes. And then in the last episode, we're going to give an overview of the contrasting narrative, God's story for sex, and how it can be so beautiful. And that contrast is just striking between the story, the image of sex that pornography gives to kids and what it's really supposed to be. That's where the real tragedy of it is these young people are, because they're raised on porn, they're missing out on what God has for them and how God has created them to live. Because we know most. Some stats I see show as many as almost 90% of pornography videos online depict sexual violence. And then you add on top of that the fact that kids are clearly believing, they're watching that, and it's basically sex ed for them. They're seeing that and thinking, this is what sex is, so I'm going to go have sex in that way. And people are believing that lie instead of what it's supposed to be. And it has so many bad effects. So um, I want to ask you also, what research have you seen showing the addictive nature of pornography among kids? I've talked about some of it in my legislative work, but I'd rather hear from you just how addictive is pornography for everybody and then maybe for kids specifically.
Well, and something to highlight with this is we're finding the overall, right? The overall effect shows these negative effects. The studies are also showing that there is a particular um, uh, disadvantaged at-risk group as well. So in many ways, our children that need the most protection, that are already struggling with mental health struggles or family disruption or other types of issues, um, they are at particular risk for these types of struggles and these types of difficulties. So we're finding, that much of pornography's greatest effects and when it becomes compulsive and addictive is when young people start to turn to it for mood regulation. It starts to become a mechanism of coping for them. It's something they turn to when they feel lonely or stressed or overwhelmed. And so it starts to become this pattern that they turn to in a way because of the way that it will trigger the pleasure centers of the brain. It will trigger the sexual response of the body in ways that gives a momentary escape, a momentary experience, but then it ultimately becomes this negative downward spiral as they're left with feelings of shame and guilt, and they feel the reality of the myth that it's a counterfeit. There's no real connection there. There's no real love. There's no real bond. And so there's just a way, and particularly when it begins with this early onset pattern. So that's why we're so concerned about, when pornography starts to get such exposure to so many at such young ages, the trajectories are just not very promising.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. I appreciate you doing that. So we've talked about, Jason, how this has impacted kids specifically and their sex life and their future families. But for most of the time, if kids are being exposed like at 10 years old, they're going to live with their family for another 8 years while they're, it's being regularly exposed to this content, probably becoming more and more addicted to it. So how is it impacting families as a whole, family life, family dynamics? And maybe you can tell us after that, what kind of families are most at risk to these negative outcomes?
Yeah, it's become this new parenting issue. Many parents are very confused. I think, as you mentioned earlier, I think parents of faith and have clear values around many of these issues. They have a very clear sense of this isn't something I want in my children's life. But because of that narrative that this is just kind of harmless leisure, or this is just what kids do, or boys will be boys or whatnot, I think there's many parents that don't feel comfortable with it. They don't feel good about it, but they don't know if they're kind of being prudish about it or whatnot. And so it becomes an area of tension, becomes an area of real struggle inside of the family. And then what it starts to lead to is another compounding factor of harm, and that's the concealment area. There's powerful research about living concealed lives. Whatever it is, there is something about not being a truthful, authentic person. And so when you feel that you have to hide a part of yourself, particularly from your loved ones and from those, you start to feel a bit of I'm a fraud. And the overall evidence is that just starts to weigh eventually on people's mental health. It starts to weigh on their emotional well-being to do that. So you can see the ways that this becomes this area of tension and struggle, and parents are trying to decide how far to go with monitoring and regulation. And that's where we see the greatest area of risk. The greatest area of struggle is when there's kind of a lack of engagement in those relationships, Warm, engaged parent-child relationships are one of the strongest protective factors around this. And so and then parents engaged in that kind of relationship also tend to be good at monitoring. And we know that as children get older, monitoring comes more through voluntary disclosure. So it really does become the quality of the relationship, that what you once kind of monitored and checked in on when they were 11 and 12, by the time they're 16, 17, 18, you really need this to kind of be a two-way street where we're able to talk and be open about these types of things. And parents making wise decisions. That's why decisions around timing of technology and kids' exposure to smartphones and other things is really getting a new examination. We're really looking at that in some new ways. The work of, Jonathan Haidt and others, and Jean Twenge, who both joined on as co-authors of our brief. So we were thrilled with that. And Brian Willoughby as well, who's a well-known pornography researcher, brought a lot of expertise. But we're just reevaluating that what we think is opening the door to some positive experiences is often coming with some real unintended side effects, and parents are learning to navigate that intersection of family life.
Yeah, and parents need help. I mean, from folks like you, who are providing this information to them is a godsend. FPA has a program called the Tech Ready Family, which helps parents get ready to or learn how to use the parental controls that are available to them on most of these operating systems, which are not all encompassing, not alone the solution, but can make a big impact. But this research we've talked about, I only have a few more questions for you, Jason, but a couple of critical ones.
You bet.
This leads to some really sci-fi like ends that are really sad and destructive. Recently, one of your colleagues, Michael Toscano, also at IFS, great ally of ours, he and I have testified together in legislative committees on these issues. He recently wrote about how the research now shows that 1 in 4 young adults would actually prefer an AI partner to a real life one. I mean, this is the age of the movie Her, the sex robots, all these things. Why should that be concerning to us? That's such a sci-fi conclusion. Why should we be so concerned about that?
We have that one study that came out from IFS. We have another study coming out from Wheatley just after the holidays that are giving us the first look at kind of the prevalence rates. The use of AI companion apps is far greater than many people would believe. As much as 1 in 4 right now of young adults, and this is early uptake. We expect that it might go well past that. The other part tying into our conversation to this point too is AI generated sexual media, AI generated pornography, and other things. I think one area that we need to be mindful of is, I think even with children in homes of faith that have learned values, there may be a little bit of something that's seductive about that they might say, well, maybe this isn't real porn. That's not a real person. That's just a computer generated image. Maybe it's not as bad, right? So I think it's important for us to teach our children when it comes to issues of modesty and personal purity and these types of things, to use an outcome definition, not just a behavior definition, right? Kind of a by their fruits ye shall know them type approach, right? That, hey, wait, what will the consequence be for you? What will this do in your life? And right now, the AI element of that is going to have the exact same impact and consequence as traditional pornography, so to speak. But parents need to be aware of this. This is the new push, the new direction, and it is concerning that there's a portion of young people using this saying, oh, I prefer AI communication to communication with real people. I feel more understood. I feel more cared about, right? We really need to help our young people understand, again, the distortion and the counterfeit, right? These AI companions are an algorithm, right? They don't like you. They don't love you. In fact, they don't even know that you exist, right? So to start then being pulled into this, that this is an interaction that I feel loved, I feel cared about, I feel understood. Again, it's a distortion, it's a counterfeit, And once again, we have an industry behind it that is not really thinking about consequences. It's all driven by profits. And it's another area where the app stores and the ability for children to access these is not being regulated because it's not real people, so to speak. But I think it'll be a major area of renewed emphasis. And I think we're going to start seeing some research really start to grow in this area too about these AI relationship technologies. And I'm completely convinced they'll show the same pattern of negative downward spiral of a temporary escape and a temporary relief or something, so to speak, but it'll leave a hollow experience, inwardly knowing this isn't real connection, that will have the same effects that we've seen with pornography and other inappropriate media.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're right. The research is going to show that, and just to me, as an even just as an amateur theologian, but very devout Christian, what a reduction of our humanity an AI relationship is. Because people, we were created in the image of God to be loved, to form intimate connections with each other, and the most intimate connections with God and with our spouse. And an AI relationship is just such a tragic reduction of that, and reduces us down to a machine too. So it's just tragic to me, and I appreciate you summarizing that. I have two more questions for you. So first of all, Jason, you're a world-class researcher and social scientist. You know how to assess research. I want you to just very briefly tell our audience, we've gone through a lot of research showing how all these terrible things, how significant is this as a body of research compared to other bodies of research establishing things that we kind of take for granted every day, we kind of know is fact?
Yeah, I mean, basically, when it comes to scientific evidence, you kind of say, hey, we've got some preliminary studies. We're starting to get a collection of studies that show some findings. But when you get to the point of these large, robust meta-analyses and reviews with consistencies of findings, and we should emphasize here too, international research here. This is one of the areas that is actually being researched across the globe, finding consistent patterns. That is the gold standard of scientific evidence. So we emphasize this in our brief to the Supreme Court, that it really isn't about just cherry picking a study here or there, and there's a bunch of conflicting studies that go different directions. These are compelling. We in fact, in the brief, we say that we're only going to review the meta-analyses and the big review studies because it is now mature to that point. So it really is inconsistent. It's deeply inconsistent in a culture like ours that is talking about the importance of the value and dignity of all people, the importance and significance of girls and women. And, we've gone through the Me Too movement of recent years saying, hey, there are these inappropriate patterns and respect. And then to have a pornography industry allowed to just present this kind of content and material. I mean, there just really needs to be a reckoning of the inconsistency of that in our culture and our society. Those two things are just wildly incompatible, and we need to be consistent because our children deserve nothing less. They are watching and they are being impacted.
Yeah, I completely agree. There needs to be that reckoning, and I'm hoping this case will open the door to at least the beginning of that, which I'll ask you about in a second. But just to illustrate the importance of your point, is I recently had an exchange with an old friend of mine where I published something about just one of the tiny pieces of research showing the harm to pornography. And this person pushed back and said, this is probably not true, or this doesn't have this impact in my life. I don't believe this research is true. And I responded to him by I tried to be gracious by saying, you can believe whatever you want. It's a free country. But at this point, you need to acknowledge that if you choose to believe that and continue to use porn and recommend it to other people, you are standing against the mountain of evidence. You're swimming against the current at this point. And that's what I want our audience to take away, is that this is the fact. All right, there. It's the rule that proves the exceptions. Where some people can use pornography and not have it have any impact in their life. I don't believe that's true, but they tell me it. Even if it is true, they are the exceptions. this is the rule. This mountain of evidence is the current. And that should encourage our audience and bolster them to go out and talk about this, because as we've said at the outset and through this series, this harm, this evil thrives off a lack of awareness.
Yeah.
So I want our audience to be confident when they go in to talk about it.
Joseph, one thought on that. We stated in our brief, right, when it comes to collective action and the protection of children, the question is not, does all pornography harm all children all of the time, right? The fundamental question is, does some pornography harm some children some of the time? And if it does, that gives us enough of a standard to take safeguards and to protect children, and to particularly protect this subset of at-risk children and particularly vulnerable children, right? Now, the research evidence goes well beyond that and clearly shows most pornography harming most children most of the time, right? But this idea that somehow the standard has to be all in every case, in every situation, risk factors are different, exposure levels are different, content may be different, right? But when we start looking at safeguarding children, we've got to start looking at the most vulnerable. I mean, research has shown an uptick across the globe of mental health struggles with young people. There's a rise of vulnerability in the rising generation, and it's making them more at risk for these, pornography, for these AI relationship technologies, for these other things. So we need to be thinking about the most vulnerable among us, and how do we make that safeguard, particularly for bills, what's being considered now, that we're just talking about age verification to age 18. That's still pretty minimal. That's still pretty, there's much more we could talk about what could be done, but that's a pretty minimal starting point that happens with age verification, with all sorts of things, to buy alcohol, to buy cigarettes, to enter a strip club, to do any of these types of things. We don't even think twice about the idea that you show identification to access that.
No, it's absolutely right, and that at least is very clear in Supreme Court precedent, which is what gives me hope for FSC v. Paxton. And on that case, so you're right, it would be a pretty basic step that state governments can take to protect those most vulnerable, because that distinction is so important. But it would still be significant in a lot of other ways for maybe opening the door to some of the other solutions. So what I want to ask you, Jason, for my final substantial question is, parents have heard all this. They'd be right to be concerned. What can they do right now? And then what would a really positive ruling in FSC v. Paxton in June mean for positive change in this issue area?
Yeah. What can parents do? I mean, we've said it a few times, but it can't be overemphasized. The parent-child relationship is one of the strongest predictors of well-being, and it is one of the strongest safeguards against this. Part of this is to just help children learn what the counterfeit is. So I think it is a balance of, it's not just the absence of negative, hey, stay away from these bad things. It is to teach very clearly and in age-appropriate ways the presence of positive, right? And to help draw, I do believe that children, and like you said, created in the image of God, they've got it is there that they can resonate with that truth. And as they can more clearly see the counterfeit that is offered, I think it can help them see things as they really are, see things in true, because all of pornography and sexual media is based on a myth. You have to give into a false myth that what you're watching isn't really what you're watching. You have to kind of pretend and go along with it for it to have its effect. So I think that that's critical. So that parent involvement, intentional. The other thing is we've laughed and joked for years about, oh yeah, my 13-year-old knows the computer better than I do. Oh yeah, I need to go get my, I understand that, as a digital, immigrant myself, raising 5 kids, I understand some of that, but we just can't afford for that to be the truth anymore these days. Parents need to be very intentional. Digital safety is just a critical issue now for our current parenting. And like you said, there's great resources out there to look for different programs. You mentioned the offerings that your group has, and others that have created some great ways to try to be knowledgeable, to be aware. And the other part is just we need collective action. Parents can't do this alone. So finding ways that we can hold, and this is where this gets back to your part of what would a positive ruling here, what would it mean? I hope that it would start to open up an even broader, both legal and cultural conversation about social media providers, pornography producers, all the, what, that they have some accountability here. This idea that it's just kind of, they can just push and promote and put out and their content, and parents just have to try to fight against this or find ways to control it. We really need a broader cultural conversation about how are we going to safeguard children, and let's get serious about our children being able to have a different kind of childhood, and one that restores to them a chance to grow up with healthy environments and examples and patterns, so that they're just in a much better position by the time they reach adulthood to succeed and to thrive in relationships and their own well-being. There's enough challenges and struggles these days. There's really a commodization here of our children. There's just there's industries behind all of behind all of this, and there just needs to be accountability, whether it's the app stores, the social media platforms, the content producers. There just needs to be a greater sense that they need to be a part of the solution rather than just somehow that's not their issue.
Yes, my local pastor here in Virginia Beach likes to say that every new religion wants to get into children's ministry. This is a war over children. And this really is an alternative religion. When it has this kind of impact on your life, this is an alternate worldview that offers something other than the goodness that God has promised and created us for. And we at FPA, we're going to present that promise in the final episode of this series. But fundamentally, we believe kids deserve to live free from the influence of pornography, and parents have the right and the obligation to God to direct the upbringing of their children, and that includes how and when they learn about sex and lose their innocence. So I think IFS joins us in at least the baseline notion there, and that's why this is so important to us, and why you say this is a collective action effort. Every single person listening to this show has a role to play in making a difference in this, both culturally and in your state houses and in the courts. So the stakes of this case are dramatic, and I appreciate you giving us a sense of that, Jason. So last thing I'll ask you is just where can people find and follow you, IFS? What kind of products do you have available and coming out as well to help equip parents? And
you bet. So ifsstudies.org, right? It'll get you to the Institute of Family Studies and the research and work that we do there and what we produce, and Michael Toscano and his whole technology initiative group now that he's leading all of that. I think there's going to continue to be some really wonderful content there that people want to track. And IFS has such a great track record too of producing material that's digestible for a broad audience and makes the research very accessible. The other would be at wheatley.byu.edu. The two that I'll emphasize is that we've mentioned is we do have the report coming out just after the holidays. That'll be a parent report, a public report that'll summarize our amicus brief to the Supreme Court. So that'll be hopefully and make people very aware of the research foundation that is here. And then also look out, Wheatley will be releasing its new large-scale national study on AI companion apps. That'll be coming out just after the holidays as well. That will give some real eye-opening reality of the traction that those technologies are getting among our young people, and probably the increased conversation that parents and church leaders and others probably need to start having around those topics. And again, I'm a little bit anxious that maybe some of our religious young people might make some moral equivocation there, that somehow because it's AI generated, it's different, and maybe they'll tell themselves it's okay. So We'll still keep researching that a little bit more to see if that's the case. But again, I think when parents are open and can help highlight the counterfeit and emphasize the real and emphasize the truth, it helps empower their children.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'll also just add IFS's recent project that you all launched called Stop Digital Harm, which is about App Store age verification. FPA has publicly endorsed that project. If people go to that website, they'll see a nice endorsement from our Vice President, Amanda Banks. We are proud to do that. We're going to work for some state legislation about apps to require age verification in app stores too. So, Jason, everything you've given parents is just terrific in this show. We're so grateful for your expertise and your effort in pouring into them through this platform of ours, and we were honored to host you. So thank you for all of it. Looking forward to further collaboration with IFS and you and your colleagues on this issue. And just thank you to our audience. Your support is what enabled us to put the court in this position where they have to reassess their jurisprudence on pornography and its impact on children. And they have to read briefs like Jason's and know what it is they're considering and what the impact of their decision will be. So thank you to our supporters. Thank you for listening. This is the Exposing Truth podcast series from Family Policy Alliance. We will see you next time.